Okay, so what we are going to do over chapters 18, 19, and 20 is develop a model of the macroeconomy in the short run. So our objective is to try to explain how different kinds of changes, and in macroeconomics we call these shocks, to say spending or interest rates or expectations, trade patterns, other kinds of things will affect the macroeconomy in the short run. And so we're going to do this in a couple of stages. The first stage encompassing these notes is to construct what's known or develop what's known as an IS curve. And an IS curve is going to show a relationship between interest rates and spending and output in the macroeconomy. Then the second thing that we're going to do, which is the second portion of chapter 18 and the part that's grayed out here in this outline, is to develop the MP curve. And MP is going to stand for monetary policy. So it's going to describe how the financial system and monetary policy in particular affect interest rates. And then by extension, we'll put those things together to describe how we can think about macroeconomic shocks and how we can describe the impact of macroeconomic shocks over the economy in the short run. So we will, in a few moments, try to contrast the short and long runs. What I want to do at this point is to again remind you of what we're doing here. So our objective is to analyze the links among spending, interest rates, financial markets, and output as a way of describing the behavior of the economy over the business cycle. So again, our business cycle perspective is one in which we are talking about the macroeconomy in the short run. In these notes, we are at this point abstracting from the impact of price changes or inflation on decision making. So you could interpret chapter 18 as one in which we are holding fixed prices. And then what we introduce in chapter 19 is a relationship between output and inflation in the macroeconomy. And then the upshot of chapter 20 is really just putting those two things together. So I'm going to ask you to read chapter 20 and we'll have some examples from it. But in fact, chapter 20 is redundant. If you understand what's going on in chapters 18 and 19, all chapter 20 is doing is putting those two things together. So at this point, what I want to do is again remark that what we're talking about here is the macroeconomy in the short run. So firms are going to adjust their production to spending in the macroeconomy. And this is what allows us to think about the focus that we're developing in chapter 18 as being one of a demand side focus. So what we're going to do, I guess, for now, and we'll relax it a little bit in once we introduce the perspective of chapter 19, is we're going to hold fixed the well, we're not. So what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that firms are holding fixed their decisions or expectations about prices and then adjusting their production behavior accordingly. So that was a little disjointed, and I'll try to clean it up a bit as we go through here. So, what I want to do before going on is to think about this distinction between the short run and the long run. So, the long run discussion is one that we've skipped over the majority of it. We've touched on it a little bit when we talked about the loanable funds market. You recall that we said we're going to presume that this discussion of the neutral real interest rate is presuming that output is at its potential level. We talked a little bit about potential gross domestic product earlier, and we're going to introduce it again here. But we didn't really dig into what are the things that determine the potential level of gross domestic product. Those are the kinds of questions that are asked when we're taking a long run perspective in macroeconomics. And so I think that we'll have a little bit of time to go to hit on that at the end of the semester. But for now, what I want to do is focus on the short run. And our short run analysis is largely comprised, if we were going to think about it in terms of chapters, the discussion in chapter 17, but again, especially chapters 18 through 20 in terms of developing the model. And then 22 talks about monetary policy, and 23 talks about fiscal policy. And each of those has a little bit of blend between short run and long run analysis, but is principally focusing on the short run analysis. When we are talking about the macroeconomy in the short run, our focus is on the demand side of the economy, and we're taking the economy's productive capacity, in other words, the potential level of gross domestic product, as given. And what we will think about in this context is why we might observe an economy in equilibrium at a level different from that potential level of gross domestic product. So what I want to get to eventually here is the idea that firms are going to adjust their production to match spending, or a synonym for spending is aggregate expenditure. And aggregate expenditure is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures and net exports. And what we're going to do is refine a little bit our description of investment here. But what this is going to mean, and the key thing that comes out of this framework, is that demand is going to be driving changes in output. And so what I want to do is think about that a little bit more, and then what we'll do is we'll use that observation to develop, in fact, the IS curve. So what do we mean by this? So what do we mean in particular about this idea that firms or that demand is what's driving output? So our starting point is that firms are forming expectations of wages and prices, or more generally, inflation rates in the macroeconomy. So they look out over the horizon and they kind of form an estimate of expected inflation, take that into account in their own pricing behavior, and we'll talk about that more deliberatively in chapter 19, and then make production decisions based upon that. So firms will have a planned level of investment expenditures, which will include a planned level of inventories. So firms want to hold some inventories, of course, to meet unexpected demand shocks. So if demand is unexpectedly high, you want to hopefully satisfy your customers, and as a result, they'll sell out of inventory. So that would be one reason why firms would hold some inventories. But the important thing here is that in the short run, firms are meeting demand at these preset wages and prices. So firms are making a plan about the amount of investment that they're going to undertake, and then what will happen is that their production behavior will fluctuate according to what demand is in the economy for their goods and services. And importantly, what we're going to see, and it'll become a little bit more transparent in chapter 19, is the idea that inflation expectations are only going to change as time passes. So again, right now, what our thought exercise is you're a firm. You look out at the set of wages and prices out there. That informs your decisions about how you're going to proceed. You can see what your competitors are going to do. You can form an expectation of how your costs are going to rise. And you take those expectations as given and formulate a plan for the amount of investment expenditures that you're going to do, and accordingly, ultimately, the amount of output that you're going to produce. So we will see, and again, this will be more of the chapter 19 stuff. So this is chapter 19, that firms' inflationary expectations are going to change once they are convinced of the persistence of a change in demand for their goods and services. So, in other words, it may be the case that demand is they are surprised by strong demand for their goods and services. Our story here is that firms are going to meet that strong demand by selling out of their inventories and then producing more before necessarily raising their prices. And the reason for this is that if they are expecting particular pricing strategy on the part of their competitors, and they are not expecting their competitors to be raising prices, then they would lose market share if they did. So similarly, if it is the case that demand is unexpectedly low, firms will not necessarily cut prices right away. What they'll do is they'll see their inventories being built up above the level that they would have otherwise wanted to carry, and as a result, they will cut their production. And it will only be with the passage of time that they might adjust their pricing behavior and their expectations about future inflation. And again, the reason why is that if you have a firm that today can look out and expect a certain price behavior on the part of its competitors, and its competitors aren't cutting prices, then it doesn't, in the face of weak demand, then it doesn't have to either. It's not going to see any kind of reason from a strategic point of view to adjust prices. So the upshot of this is that it's going to be unplanned changes in inventories that provide a signal for firms to adjust their production, or in other words, their quantities, rather than prices. So firms, again, in this immediate short run period, are holding their expectation about prices and inflation rate accordingly fixed. So it is important for me to state as loudly as I can that we're describing a short run equilibrium. And a short run equilibrium for the macroeconomy is going to be a situation in which what's produced or supplied on the part of firms equals what's demanded, or equals the spending by other firms, households, the government, and the net of the rest of the world at these preset prices. So in the textbook, we'll introduce the idea of aggregate expenditure in just one moment. But in the textbook, the equation that you see is this idea that the amount of goods and services that are produced, so this is production, is equal to aggregate expenditures. And again, a synonym for this is spending. And again, we can think about this as supply, the supply of goods and services, and this is the demand. And our story is that as spending changes, then it's going to be the case that firms respond to that by adjusting their production. So what is it that accomplishes this? What accomplishes this adjustment of production to demand, or production to spending, is the signal that comes from unplanned changes in inventories. So, in other words, this is how we are thinking about aggregate expenditure. So firms in particular make some plan for the amount of investment that they're going to undertake, and this includes planned inventory. Just so there's no confusion, it includes, it's not limited to planned inventory, of course, but it includes planned inventory investment. And so if it is the case that demand, consumption plus other firms' investment decisions plus government expenditures plus net exports is weak, then unplanned inventories will rise. And as a result of that, firms will ratchet downward their production. So let me see if I can figure out, get to my screen here. So a short run, this is important to understand but subtle. So a short run SR, uh, macroeconomic equilibrium, is where, again, what's produced or supplied equals what's demanded, or in other words, spending. And what is this? This is the synonym for this is aggregate expenditure. This is spending by households, planned spending by firms on investment expenditures, government expenditures, and net exports. And so if it is the case that demand, so if demand, meaning aggregate expenditure, well, if demand is unexpectedly weak, then inventories, firms' inventories, of course, will rise above the planned level. That sends a signal to firms to cut production. And conversely, if demand were unexpectedly strong, then inventories would drop. Firms would sell out of meet that demand out of inventories, but that would send a signal for them to increase their production. So what we are imagining is that when we have a short run equilibrium, we have a situation in which the planned level of investment and the actual level of investment are the same. So this, another way of thinking about this is that because the amount of production has to be equal to the amount of spending, the way in which that's true is if the actual amount of investment that's undertaken in the macroeconomy is the level that's planned. And what we're going to be describing on the IS curve in a little while is a whole bunch of points where along that IS curve, we're tracing out individual short run macroeconomic equilibria. Again, this is a fairly subtle point. It's something that's not going to be, you know, cataclysmic if you don't get it over the course of this semester, but certainly for students who are thinking about going on in economics and with a particular interest in macroeconomics should understand this dynamic, and you'll see it again when you take other macroeconomics classes. So the important thing here is for you to recognize that this short run macroeconomic equilibrium need not correspond to full employment and therefore potential gross domestic product. It can be the case that in the short run, because demand is determining production, that the amount of total demand and spending and therefore production can be different from the economy's maximum sustainable level of output. In other words, its level of potential real GDP. So potential real GDP is this long run level of output that can be sustainably produced. And by sustainable, what we have in mind, as we'll kind of make a little bit more transparent going through these next several chapters, is without the economy overheating and inflation resulting, or without the economy experiencing cyclical unemployment and disinflation resulting. So what I want to do is remind you of some pictures that we have seen before, or versions of these. So in this upper picture, we have potential output in red, and this is again the level of gross domestic product consistent with full employment. It's the maximum sustainable level of production that the economy can undertake. And we talked about that idea of full employment as being consistent with frictional and structural unemployment only. Actual output can be both, or it can be either above the potential level or below. So actual output is more commonly, say in recent US history, below the potential level. So here we had inequality, but for this period, for the basically the duration of the 1980s, the actual gross domestic product was less than potential. And we had a period in the late 1990s and early 2000s before the recession where actual gross domestic product exceeded potential. So that's right there. Uh, and so we can see as well, oops, sorry, periods in which we have, more or less equality. And so that would be like a point there. So the important thing to recognize here for what we're going to be doing later is that we can have a macroeconomic equilibrium, a short run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the economy is producing at less than its potential. So we can see, in other words, an economic slump where Y is less than the potential level of gross domestic product and still call that a short run equilibrium because businesses don't want to produce any more output, because people aren't interested in buying it. Demand is weak. And people don't want to spend more because the economy is weak. So we can think about recessions in this context, this short run phenomenon of recessions, first of all, as being one of a couple of examples of self fulfilling prophecies. We can be, in other words, stuck at this below optimal level of gross domestic product. So this is an example again in which recessions can be thought of as a set of individually rational decisions being made, but the outcome is collectively terrible. So all individuals are looking at, their own income level, for instance, is falling, and so they don't want to buy more stuff, and similarly firms don't want to produce anymore because there isn't any demand for it. Collectively, if firms would produce more, that would generate more income. We know from the circular flow idea, and then households would be better off. And so we could talk about that as being something that's good, but there's no incentive for the private market to solve that problem. It's in an equilibrium. It's just not a happy equilibrium. And this then provides the justification for intervening in the macroeconomy with monetary policy or fiscal policy, say in times of a recession. Because in essence, this fact that we can be stuck at a level of gross domestic product that is below the potential level and have that be an equilibrium, and by equilibrium there is no further tendency for change, that we can think about that as a market failure. The private market is failing to achieve what is the economy's maximum sustainable level of output. And so the use of monetary policy or fiscal policy in this context can be thought of from a philosophical point of view as being good because it is correcting a market failure that's occurring. We talked a little bit again about this idea back in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Now, problems can also arise too when the level of gross domestic product is bigger than potential. We might think, oh, if we've got unemployment and situations in which we have these negative output gaps like this, then perhaps a positive output gap is a good thing. But we will see subsequently. But we can also kind of talk through that when we have a positive output gap, that's a situation in which the available resources are, in a sense, more than fully employed. So we're working, say, people are working more than their sustainable levels, or more people are working than we would think of as being consistent with this long run sort of more sustainable level. And if you think about it at your own and in your own lives, I kind of think about the school year as one in which I'm gunning it faster than my sustainable level, because you just got to keep running on that treadmill, and then a break comes along and you get to sort of slide back down to sustainable, maybe. So it is possible at the macroeconomic level, in that same way, that you can do more in the short run than what is good for you in the long run in terms of, say, work effort. That's also true for the macroeconomy. But if we think about what's likely to be happening, producers will be doing what they can to keep up. So how do they do that? How do they run, their factories harder? Well, they're going to be deferring maintenance. They might run extra overnight shifts. They might pay their workers overtime, but that isn't sustainable. Eventually, the economy is going to overheat. And as we'll see in chapter 19, those pressures can spark inflation and force a correction. And so, what we can see then is that a macroeconomic equilibrium tells us this. So, this is defined, given this defines um, the short run macro level, macroeconomic level of equilibrium GDP, but that need not be the potential level. And so, as a result, when we think about the output gap, recall that we defined this earlier as the extent to which gross domestic product is different from potential, expressed as a fraction of potential. We can then think about the output gap, in a sense, as telling us something about the balance between supply and demand in the economy. So when the output gap becomes more negative, then we think about the demand in the macroeconomy being weaker and weaker relative to the maximum sustainable amount of output that the economy can produce. And conversely, when the output gap becomes more positive, then it's going to be the case that we're either getting closer to the economy's potential supply, or its long run supply, or or we've exceeded it. So in my previous comment over here, what I mean by this comment is that we can think about this potential level as telling us something about the long run supply or capacity in the economy. So again, this is sustainable level of GDP. And because we're talking about a macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run, this is demand driven, right? So production in the short run responds to spending. And so when I say, again, that we can think about the output gap as telling us something about the balance between demand and supply, we're kind of looking at this tension between what the economy is doing in the short run, which defines the actual level of gross domestic product and is demand side driven, versus what the economy is capable of doing in the long run as defined by the potential level of gross domestic product. And so before developing the IS curve itself, what I want to do is just try to summarize, because I listen to myself a little bit and it sounds sometimes a bit confusing. So what we're trying to do here is or what I want to do, first of all, is highlight that I'm using different words synonymously. So spending, aggregate expenditure, demand, those are all synonyms for one another. And similarly, on the supply side, output, production, supply, those are synonyms. So aggregate expenditure, demand, spending, these are the same, one idea. And then similarly, production, supply, output, these are the same idea. So I use these words interchangeably. And then an equilibrium for the macroeconomy in the short run is when we have spending and production the same. And we get to that point because of the signal that comes from unplanned inventory changes. And then what we're going to, and then what we noted in the previous couple of slides is that in this short run equilibrium, so this is our, again, short run equilibrium. In this short run equilibrium, actual gross domestic product can be greater than or less than or equal to the potential level. And so we focus on the output gap as a way of disentangling the impact of demand and supply side forces in the macroeconomy. So what we're going to turn to now is the development of an IS curve, and we'll talk about why it's called IS at the conclusion of that development. But essentially what it is a curve or a line that illustrates how lower real interest rates raise spending and gross domestic product and lead therefore to a more positive output gap, and conversely, when interest rates are otherwise higher, spending and GDP are lower and the output gap becomes more negative. This is where all of the hard work that we put you put in chapters 13, 14, and 16 come into play. In those chapters, what we were doing was tracing out the impact of interest rates on consumption, investment, government expenditures to some extent, and net exports. And so I will refer you back to those notes. I'm going to give you kind of the quick overview of what we talked about before, but we talked about in chapter 13. So this is chapter 13. This is chapter 14. This was also in chapter 14 when we talked about the loanable funds market, and this is chapter 16. In all of those chapters, I made a point of saying what is the relationship between spending and the real interest rate. So for consumption, we noted that the real interest rate represents the opportunity cost of undertaking consumption, in that when you consume a dollar of after-tax income, you give up the opportunity to have saved it and earned interest income. So when the interest rate drops, the cost of consumption, if you will, the opportunity cost of consumption in terms of interest income foregone goes down. And we would talk about there being an increase in the quantity of consumption. And that's this movement along the consumption line that's described here. And we saw in the earlier chapters. I didn't draw it in the notes, but we talked about it. Similarly, in chapter 14, we noted that one way to think about it would be to think about the rational rule for investment, right? We compared the present value and the cost, compared those, and the present value of the stream of returns. We said if we had a particular sort of example, we could say that this is the return next year's return divided by R plus the real interest rate plus the depreciation rate, for instance. And so what do we observe? Other things equal, when the interest rate goes down, when this goes down, then the present value of the stream of future returns that the firm is going to get goes up, and that would increase the quantity demanded of investment because there would be more profitable projects that would be undertaken. We saw, I'm going to come over to the net export picture first and then go back to the government purchases one. In chapter 16, we saw that the impact between interest rates and um, and net exports is through the exchange rate. We could also see this, also saw this via net capital inflows. But I think that it's typically easier for people to think about this exchange rate link. So in particular, we saw that if, sorry, if interest rates, say in the US, rise relative to interest rates abroad, then that's going to be something that causes the US dollar to appreciate. And we will think about this as an appreciation in real terms. And oops, so never mind. So it's not consistent with my picture. Sorry. So if it is the case that there is a decrease in interest rates in the US relative to those abroad, then this would be something that would cause the US dollar to depreciate and other things equal, meaning that's a real depreciation. That would be something that would cause US goods and services to be relatively cheaper, foreign goods and services to be relatively more expensive, and the quantity of net exports would go up, and obviously vice versa. And then we saw in our discussion of the loanable funds market that we could imagine potentially a relationship between interest rates and government expenditures. And the story here would be that if there is a decrease in real interest rates, then from the government's point of view, that decreases the interest cost of servicing the debt. And so for a given level of tax revenues that the government collects, there could be more available for government spending. Empirically, there's very little relation between changes in real interest rates and changes in government expenditures. And that's why in this picture, the authors draw this as a very steep line. In fact, you could draw a vertical as far as I'm concerned. And I will also be very clear in saying, I'm not going to ask you to draw a picture like this, but that would be the story. So what do we observe? This implies, right, for all of these things, we see that decrease in R leads to an increase in the quantity of consumption. Decrease in the real interest rate leads to an increase in the quantity of investment. Potentially, a change in decrease in real interest rate leads to an increase in government expenditures. And this, we said, would increase the quantity of net exports as we see. And so, what do we observe? We observe that at lower real interest rates, there is a higher level of aggregate expenditure. And at higher real interest rates, there would be a lower level of aggregate expenditure. And now what we can do is we can put this together with what we were talking about in the notes earlier. Specifically, oops, sorry about that. So specifically, we have observed that lower real interest rates boost aggregate expenditure. That's what the previous slide showed us. What we just talked about is the idea that in the short run, firms adjust production to spending or to demand. In other words, that's what I have there. And so if it is the case that there is an increase in aggregate expenditure, then there's an increase in gross domestic product. Why? We can then say this is going to be something that increases the output gap, because again, the output gap is the level of production relative to potential as a fraction of potential. And we multiply by 100%. So if Y is going up, then the output gap becomes more positive. And if Y is going down, then the output gap is becoming more negative. So this language is, I think, helpful and important to kind of keep straight. So an increase in Y means the output gap becomes more positive, rather than talking about bigger or smaller, since this could be a positive or a negative number. And then similarly, a decrease in Y means that the output gap becomes more negative. So that'll be the language that we use in this. So now what we can do is put this together in our characterization of an IS curve. So an IS curve is going to illustrate how lower real interest rates are associated with a more positive output gap, and conversely, higher real interest rates are associated with a more negative output gap. So we go from the real interest rate, changes in the real interest rate, right, lead to a decrease in the real interest rate, leads to an increase in aggregate expenditure or spending in the economy. That leads to an increase in production, which leads to a more positive output gap, and vice versa. So that's what we have. So we put it's kind of like what we have done before with other curves and lines in this case. We put a price variable on the vertical axis, the real interest rate. We put the output variable on the horizontal axis. So this is y minus potential level divided by the potential level, again, times 100 to express it as a percentage. And what we can observe is that if it is so what we observe is that we have this downward sloping relationship. So in particular, if it is the case that the interest rate were to fall from 4% to 1%, we would see an output gap that is going to become more positive and a movement along this IS curve, right? So we're moving from a point like point A to a point like point B. And why does this happen? Well, again, decrease in R leads to an increase in CI, net exports, and possibly G. And that increase in aggregate expenditure is going to lead to a higher level of production, and that is going to lead to a more positive output gap, and vice versa. The IS curve is sometimes, well, where the IS curve then gets its name from is sort of old-fashioned. It's coming from the fact that we're describing the relationship between real interest rates, investment, and spending or saving decisions in the macroeconomy. So I and S are standing for investment and spending, or alternatively, investment and saving. So notice what we've done here. We have a line, we've talked about its slope. So slope is increase or decrease the real interest rate. We have a more positive output gap. Increase the real interest rate. We have a more negative output gap. What do we do after that all the time? Once we've talked about the slope, we talk about the shifters. So a spending shock is any kind of thing that is going to change the position of the IS curve. And so a spending shock does so because it changes aggregate expenditure in the macroeconomy. And of course, that means that firms are going to adjust their production to that. Spending shocks shift the IS curve. So again, this is where we reap the benefit of all of that hard work in the previous three-ish chapters. So what are the things that shift the IS curve? We've already talked about this. So what things cause consumption to change? So you go back to chapter 13. Again, this is chapter 13. This is chapter 14. This is chapter 16. And this is, we've already talked about it, so we'll we'll leave that alone for a moment. But consumption, we already noted consumption is going to rise when people are wealthier, when they're happier, when they have greater levels of government assistance, lower taxes, and potentially reduced inequality. So, by government assistance, we're going to think about transfer payments in here. And I want to comment on that in what follows below. And the inequality thing, I think, begs a little bit of explanation. Recall that we talked about different types of consumers in the macroeconomy, and particularly the idea that people that were more hand to mouth consumers would have a higher marginal propensity to consume. So when we say that reductions in inequality should shift the IS curve to the right, what we mean by this is that if we undertook actions in the macroeconomy to redistribute income from high income people to low income households, the high income people would have lower incomes and reduce their consumption. The lower income people would have higher incomes and increase their consumption. And because the higher income people have a lower marginal propensity to consume, what we would predict is that their reduction in consumption would be smaller than the increase in consumption that would be undertaken by the more hand to mouth consumers or the lower income people, so that overall aggregate consumption would increase. And we talked about this in the chapter 13 notes as well. For investment expenditures, again, in chapter 14, we talked about all the things that shift investment, GDP growth, confidence, tax credits, all of these kinds of things. We don't need to restate them here. For government expenditures, for G, so when there are discretionary changes in government expenditures, like the government decides to buy more planes or build more roads, then that's clearly an increase in government expenditures. There are certain types of spending that change in the macroeconomy automatically. So, by this idea of automatic stabilizers, what we mean is that there's some spending, such as, say, spending on Medicaid or spending on food stamps, that picks up when the economy contracts and reverses or drops down when the economy expands, because they are tied to fluctuations in income levels. These are technically transfer payments, so they're not things that would increase government expenditures, but can nonetheless impact the IS curve through this redist through redistribution. So this word is not coming out today, and that's what we mean. What I meant by up here as well. So through this idea that there can be relative changes in consumption at a more disaggregated level, because we see redistribution to folks who are going to be more inclined to consume rather than to save. And then finally, in the previous set of notes, I don't remember what part it was, maybe part 3, I don't, of the foreign exchange market notes. In any event, we talked about the idea that net exports will change in response to changes in the value of the dollar. And we also talked about the idea that net exports can change in response to global GDP growth. What we can do is talk for a second about this notion of trade barriers. The idea of trade barriers would be that if unilaterally say the UK dropped its trade barriers, then there would be easier access to the UK by US firms. We would predict that there would be an increase in US exports, say, to the UK, and therefore an increase in net exports in the US and a rightward shift in the IS curve. Similarly, if we were to consider, say, a situation in which trade barriers in the US rose unilaterally, with respect to another country, then that would be something that would discourage our exports to the rest of the world, also would potentially, but more importantly, would discourage our imports from the rest of the world. So when we raise tariffs against China, for instance, as has happened over the last several years, that makes it harder for Chinese firms to sell their goods in the United States. We see a reduction in imports from China, other things equal, and an increase in U.S. net exports. More typically, trade barriers are going to change for lots of different countries and multilaterally, so the impact on net exports is going to become murkier. You don't typically see these unilateral changes, but if we wanted to talk about one kind of a unilateral change in trade barriers, that would be the story. Now, when we think about this shift in the IS curve, when the IS curve shifts, it's going to be the case that it shifts and reflects two things happening. So there's an initial change in one of the determinants of aggregate expenditure, meaning either there's an increase in C or I, or an increase in government expenditures, or an increase in net exports. But then we know, because of our friend the circular flow, that that's going to prompt an additional multiplied effect on spending in the macroeconomy. So why is that? If if consumption goes up, for instance, then that spending generates income in the economy, which allows more spending to occur, generating more income, more spending, more income, and so forth. So we can talk about this shift in the IS curve as reflecting two things happening. So in other words, this change in gross domestic product, this is the increase in Y, that causes the output gap to become more positive in this particular example. This would be, for instance, due to, say, an increase in investment being, equal to 50, and then some number that represents the multiplier. What I want to do is think about this multiplier and then comment briefly. So here would be a simple example of a multiplier effect. Let's suppose that investment increases by $5, and let's suppose that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. So firms increase investment by $5. That means income rises by $5. That then is going to spawn a change in consumption according to the marginal propensity to consume. And so households, for instance, would be able to spend, according to this marginal propensity to consume, $3.75 more on consumption. That would become somebody else's income, which would generate additional consumption. So 0.75 times 3.75 is 2.81, which becomes income spawning additional consumption, which becomes income, and so forth. And so we could add up all of the cumulative change in income. And what I would predict is that the total change in income that occurred as a result of this initial change in investment is $20. And so what we would be doing is saying the change in GDP would be this $5 increase in investment times the multiplier. And if the change in GDP is $20, this is telling me that the multiplier is 4. Now, we can be a little bit more savvy about that. Even, I am not going to ask you to reproduce a table like this, ever. I am not going to ask you to reproduce what happens on the next slide, but you do need to understand that this is the description of the degree to which an IS curve would shift. It's going to shift by the initial increase in spending and some multiplied effect. So What's the cumulative change in real GDP? It is the change in income, 5 plus 3.75 plus 2.81 plus so forth, so on and so forth. So that's what I have here. So this is the change in income, right? Change in Y. We can factor out a $5 here. So what is 3.75? It was the initial change in income times the marginal propensity to consume. That led to, so this is round 2, round 3, and so forth. We can factor out the $5. It's common to all terms, and we get the 0.75s here. And this is another example similar to one we saw before when we were developing that shortcut for calculating the present value in our investment problems. This is an infinite geometric series, and it is going to converge, and it converges to this value, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So to just check, this is $5. If we had a marginal propensity to consume of 3/4, this would be 1 minus 0.75. This would be 1 over 0.25. That would be 1 over 1/4, and that would be 4. And so again, that does give us the $20 that we identified in our previous description. In real life, the actual multiplier is lower than 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume in some instances, depending on your estimates, way lower. Some estimates show a multiplier of 0, but that'll be subject for a future discussion, perhaps in this class and certainly in another macro type class. Reasons why the multiplier is smaller than this is just a kind of the biggest it could possibly be, is to think about that spending and respending process. If consumers buy products from the rest of the world, then income is flowing out of the US for those purchases and isn't available for spending and respending. We didn't take into account taxes, and so every time households have to pay some taxes, that siphons income off from that spending and respending process. So and then there can also be inflation that happens, and we'll see this in the Chapter 19 discussion. As a practical matter, estimating the size of the multiplier is really, really important task, and certainly something that you see being discussed in descriptions of how big should government spending be, say, in the next wave of spending for the COVID pandemic. There are discussions of how big is this multiplier. And so it's something that is important. We'll talk about it just a little bit more when we do the Chapter 23 material, but probably not a ton more. So where do we go from here? Where we go from here is to combine this IS curve that we have, this one, with the MP curve. And again, so we want to combine with MP, and that tells us about monetary policy. And with that, we can describe sort of behavior of the macroeconomy. We can trace through supply shocks, or excuse me, not supply shocks, spending shocks, monetary policy shocks, and financial crises shocks, and their impacts on interest rates and the output gap. So we can essentially describe the business cycle. So we will get to that in the next set of notes.